You've downloaded and set up everything. We're going to start working on the app. First, we're going to create a layout file for the application. To do that, go into the resource folder and under layout, we'll create a new layout resource file. Name this file Fragment Checklist. And for the root element, select Constraint Layout. You'll see that it will be showing a design view, which is what your root layout will look like. We'll select Split here so that we can have a look at what it will look like using code and for the design. Under Constraint Layout, we will create a new element called Recycler View. For the layout width, we will select Match Parent. And finally, for the ID, we will call it Checklist with RV. Recycler View is a container used to hold many items of the same layout. Here you can see that we are setting the width and the height to be match parent, which covers the whole screen. ID is used as an identifier that we can use later on to select the specific view. As we have not specified any item layout yet, you can see a sample layout of what this will look like, which will be just simple items one at a time. Next, we're going to create a new layout file called View Checklist Item. This layout file will be used by the Recycler View to display the individual items later on. Similar as the previous step, go to Layout and create the new layout file. Once you're in, go to the Split tab again, and first we're going to create a new view called Checkbox. This time we're going to use wrap content for the view because we do not want the view to take up the whole screen. The ID will be called Checkbox. To see how this checkbox will look like in the selected state, you can set the parameter check to be true. You see a red line here at the moment because we have not set the constraints on the view. Inside constraint layout, you must always set where your view will want to be. And so for here, we want to set the start to the start parent and the top to the top parent. This means that we want to set the view in the top left corner of our parent. Next up, we're going to add the edit text. Again, the width and the height are going to be wrap content for now. And we will add another ID as well. Let's call it item text. Similar to the checkbox, we will need to set the constraints, and the top will be to the top parent as well. But here we will want to set the start to the end of, and we'll specify the checkbox. So here you can see why we will need to add an ID to our parent views. Width we'll set to 0 dB for now, and I'll explain why later on. Our last view is going to be an image view. Again, we're going to set the width and height as wrap content. And then we're going to set the constraints to the image view. Here we will be setting the image view to the top right corner. And because this is an image view, we can set a source with the drawable file which we have already provided. So as you can see, the image will be in the top right corner of our parent view. In order to make things look nicer, we will set the bottom constraint to be matching the checkbox. Here we're going back to the edit text in order to update the view so that the ID, so we need to add an ID first. to our image view. And now for edit text, we can set the constraint so that the end of this edit text matches the start of the image view. So as you can see, because we set our view width to be 0, it automatically takes up all the remaining space between the two views. In order to make this look better, let's add some spacing to our individual views. Here, let's add a margin top. Margin top is a spacing that will go on the top of the view. So here we have already defined some dimensions for you, and you can just add it in. Instead of setting the parameter to be checked, we can use something called tools. This allows us to see what it would look like if the user added the checkbox to be set to true, but it doesn't actually do anything. Finally, let's add some padding to the root layout. So here we're going to add the top padding first. Padding is a little bit different from margin in that padding only adds spacing inside of the view, whereas margin adds spacing outside of the view. So the padding top and bottom, we will be using the same vertical padding, and then we would be adding the left and right, which will be called start and end paddings. If you click into the dimensions, you'll be able to see the default dimensions that we have supplied. These are just a place to store all your dimensions so they'll be easier to make changes later on. Next, let's add some padding to the edit text as well. So here we're going to specify the margin start. And also the margin end. Finally, you can add tools text to see what user input would look like. Now we are ready to move into the next step, which is the placeholder view for when there are no items in the recycler view. Again, we go to our layout and we will create a new layout file. After creating this file, before we actually add views, let's create some new dimensions. These dimensions will allow us to easily control the size that we want for each individual view. First, let's add a dimension for the icon size. Next, let's add a new dimension for the internal margins for our text view. Finally, add a dimension for the text view default sizing. Now we're ready to start adding the views inside our placeholder view. First, we will want to add an image view. This time, instead of adding wrap content or match parent, we want to use the dimension that we created previously. For the source file, we will want to use the add drawable that we have already supplied. And since this is inside the constraint layout, we will want to specify where we want the view to be. This time we want it to be in the left side of the parent, but also centered vertically. As you can see, because our parent file layout height is set to match parent, the view covers the whole screen. Change that to be wrap content instead. This will allow the view to only take up as much height as necessary. After that, we can add the text view. For the width and height, just set it to wrap content. After that, we will want to set up some margins for the text view as well. For that, let's add the ID to the image view so we can reference it. Now we can set the positioning on the text view using the ID, and here we want the text view to just be in the middle between the plus icon and also the end of the parent. Because this is a placeholder, we can set the text to be a standard string, so we have already provided you just a simple placeholder string. Finally, we want to do some touch-up. So in the color section, we will want to add a new color for our default text. This can be anything you want, but for now, we're just going to insert a default dark bluish color into here. After that, we're going to go back to our text view and update the text color as well as a text size for the layout. At this stage, all our layout files are ready, so we are able to move on to creating the data files. First, we will be going into our application package files instead of the layout resource files to create a new file where we will hold our data class. Click Create New Kotlin class and name this checklist item. We will be using a sealed class here, which is similar to an enum, but it will provide more control for us as it will allow us to define what our data will look like. First, we will have a data class called content, and we will define some variables that we want to store in here. For our purposes, content will be each individual item inside the recycler view, so they will have an item ID, whether it's checked or not, and the text displayed itself. And the second one we want is just a create item placeholder. As this does not contain any data, we do not need to create a data class, so an object will be sufficient for our purposes. With the data set up, it is time to create the actual adapter for our recycler view. This adapter will be responsible for controlling how the data looks. Inside our Kotlin file, we will create a new class called checklist adapter. Before working on the adapter, we will first need to set up a few helper classes. First, create a checklist item div callback and have this object extend the div util.item callback. The type will be checklist item. What this is used is so that when the recycler view has creating the items, it will know whether the two rows are the same and whether it should be updated or removed. are items the same checks whether the two rows are actually the same items or not. So here we would always have two items to compare, an old item and a new item. Because we have two different types, first we want to check whether the old item is a simple create item placeholder and a new item is a create item placeholder or not. The second case we want to check is whether it is a content item. Unlike the simple placeholder, other than checking whether the old item and a new item are both content types, we will also want to check whether the item ID is the same. This will cover both cases for when the recycler view is showing the data. Now, the second method are whether the contents are the same. So even though the two items are the same, the information may have updated. So for example, the content data may have changed the text or the checkbox status may have changed. So here we will just check whether the old item equals the new item, as the data class already includes the default equals checking. Now we have created the item div callback, we need to create something called view holder. So create a new class called checklist item view holder that takes in a view and extends the recycler view.viewHolder. A view holder is a class that will determine what the individual row would look like and how the data would be updated for each row. So first we will create the content item view holder that takes in a view binding. A view binding is a tool that allows us to directly reference the views that we have without having to actually find each individual view. So remember, we previously created the layout view checklist item.xml. View bindings will automatically be created for us in the name of the file. So here it will be directly called view checklist item binding with the keyword at the end. And if you click on it, you'll see we'll be taken to the exact XML file that we created earlier. So once we have the reference to the view binding, we will be able to update our data based on the information passed in. So we'll create a helper function called bind that takes in the content item. This will allow us to update each individual row based on the information provided. So for this, we will want to update the checkbox whether it is checked or not. And also in the text, we will want to set it to what we have been provided. Now we have the content item view holder. Let us create the placeholder view item holder. So just underneath, in the same seal class, we will want to create a new class called create placeholder view holder. And this, instead of taking in a view binding, we can just take in a generic view because we do not need to update any information inside the placeholder. Now we have these two helper classes set up, we can move on to our direct checklist adapter. The checklist adapter is responsible for controlling how the data is created and also how the information is displayed to the users. So first, we will want to extend the class listAdapter. And for the view type, we want to pass in checklist item because we are displaying items of data class checklist item. And then we will pass in the view holder, which we created already. And finally, the checklist item div callback. So what this is saying is that this adapter will be displaying data of checklist item, which is either a content or a placeholder. The view holder, which is the actual view which will be displayed, is already configured by us. And finally, the diff item callback will be used to determine whether each view should be updated or removed as users scroll. There are two base methods that you must implement for this to work. The first is onCreateViewHolder. This is to determine which type of view holder you want to create. As we have two different types of view holders, let us create two variables so that we know which one corresponds to which. First one, let's call it content item view type, and that is just a simple integer. And the second one is a placeholder item view type. As long as the two do not clash, it does not matter what type of numbers you enter in there. And so now when we want to create the view holder, we know that we have a view type being passed in, and so we check if it is a content item view type. We want to create the checklist item view holder, and we would need to pass in the view binding. This is automatically generated for us based on the XML file, so we just need to call the correct item binding and then call .bind with the layer inflator, which inflates the specific layer resource file that we are using for this view binding. In this case, we will want to use the view checklist item.xml file. And here we'll just pass in parent and false. For the second case, the placeholder item view type, because we do not need to worry about view binding, we can just directly inflate our view and pass it in. And this time we will be using the view checklist item create placeholder.xml file. At this point, sometimes the lines may go outside of your monitor, so you can do a quick formatting using the shortcut Command Option L. This will allow your text to be ordered more in a formatted way. Finally, we want to add an else case to catch any cases where it should not be handled, and throw an illegal argument exception to let the user know that they have tried to create a view type that should not be possible. Once the create view holder is finished, we want to move on to Onbind view holder. This method is used to determine what type of data is supposed to be shown to the user. So here we are checking if the holder is a content item view holder, because that's the only one that actually changes data. And we call .bind using the get item position to return the specific item. Now at this stage, you know that we have two different types of views, but how does the actual adapter know which one to use? We have to override one more method called get item view type. So after we pass in a list of items to this adapter, this view holder will need to check what the type of class the object is at a specific position. And if it is of type content, we will want to return the content item view type. Otherwise, we will return the placeholder item view type. So at this stage, everything is ready. And let's do a quick recap so that you will not be confused later on. The adapter has three main methods. First, get item view type determines which item view type you want to use for each item in the list of data you provide to this adapter. Once you have it, you will go on to the onCreate view holder, where you would have the view type of that specific item that you need to create. We will check which one we want, and we will use the seal class checklist item view holder to determine which view holder we want to use. Think of this as the blueprint of which layout we want to use. Finally, in the Onbind view holder, this would give us the blueprint, and we will populate the data so that each row will have the correct information. In this case, only the content view holder has specific information, so that is used. And this diff item callback is used when users are scrolling to determine whether the view should be updated or not. With the adapter finished, we can now move on to creating the fragment, which is the UI screen that users will be seeing in their phone. Create a new file called checklist fragment. This file will extend the fragment class, and we'll pass in our layout file which we've already created called fragment checklist. You can see we already have the recycler view inside, and so we will be able to use our newly created adapter for this recycler view. First, we will create a new adapter and assign it to a variable inside our file. Next, we want to override the onViewCreated method. This method is called once the fragment is ready to be displayed to the user, and you can start setting up your own data. Just like the previous view binding, we will want to assign this binding to our fragment checklist XML file. So after we have the view binding, we are able to call the reference to our recycler view and make the necessary setup. For the recycler view, we need to first set our layout manager, which is responsible for how the layout will be displayed. A linear layout manager simply means the data will be displayed one row at a time from top to bottom. Next, we will want to set the adapter for this recycler view to the one we already created. And finally, we're able to add some data to the adapter. We just need to call submit list and pass in the list of items to the adapter. Here it is just a dummy content for now, but it will be changed later on. So we can create a number of items that we need, and then we just need to make sure we pass in the information like the item ID, whether it's checked or not, and also the text. And here I'm just going to paste in a few more dummy data so that we have something to see when we run the app. And so as you can see, we're just passing in some information that can be seen by the user. And finally, we will add the placeholder item to the bottom. Now we are ready for the final step. Go into the main activity file and take a look at the content view. Here we have the default text view, which you should see when you first ran the app. We're going to replace this with the fragment that we already have. The width and the height will be match parent. We'll set the ID to be list fragment. And then in the name parameter, we will use the name of the fragment that we just created, checklist fragment. Delete the previous text view. Now in the top emulator, you should select the pixel free if it's not already selected, and you can run the app. You will see an indicator down below to show that the app is compiling, and you should see your list of items displayed. You can interact with the checkboxes as well as each individual text item. With this, you have completed step 1 of the workshop. Now that you've completed step 1, it will be a good idea to commit your changes so that you'll be able to have a checkpoint to return to. Open the terminal and add all the files and commit with the message Workshop Step 1.